Somewhere in your family, there's probably a photograph of a relative who doesn't quite look like the rest of the family tree. Black hair, dark eyes, skin that tans instead of burns, standing next to cousins with red hair, freckles, and pale Northern European coloring, in a family that has always, without question, called itself Irish. And somewhere along the way, somebody in your family gave you an explanation for that photograph. They probably called it Black Irish, and they probably told you it went back to 1588, to a shipwreck, and to Spanish sailors from a doomed naval invasion who supposedly washed up on the Irish coast and never left. It is one of the most widely repeated origin stories in the entire Irish diaspora, and it has been told, almost word for word, in Irish-American families from Boston to Chicago to rural Appalachia for well over a century. It is also, according to the actual DNA evidence, almost certainly wrong. But here's the part that makes this story worth 30 minutes of your time instead of 30 seconds. The DNA evidence didn't just disprove the Armada myth. It replaced it with something genuinely stranger and, honestly, more remarkable. A real, physical, ancient connection between Ireland and the Iberian Peninsula that has nothing to do with 1588, and everything to do with a migration that happened almost 4,000 years earlier, long before there was a Spain, a Portugal, or an Ireland as we'd recognize any of them today. If your family has ever used the phrase Black Irish, if there's a specific branch of your family tree that's always looked just slightly different from the rest, or if your DNA test has ever shown Iberian ancestry that nobody in the family could explain, stick with me for the next half hour. Because we're going to walk through exactly where this myth came from, why it caught on so completely, what the actual science says instead, and how to read your own results once you know what you're actually looking at. Let's start with the myth itself, because you need to understand it in full before you can understand why it falls apart. In the summer of 1588, Spain launched the Armada, a fleet of roughly 130 ships carrying close to 30,000 men, meant to invade England, remove Elizabeth I from the throne, and restore Catholic rule to the British Isles by force. It failed catastrophically. English ships, better maneuvered and better positioned, harassed the Armada up the English Channel. Then the weather did what the English Navy couldn't quite finish. A brutal series of Atlantic storms scattered the retreating Spanish fleet north around Scotland and down the west coast of Ireland, wrecking an estimated 24 or more ships along the Irish coastline, from Antrim in the north down to Kerry and Clare in the southwest. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned. Others made it to shore exhausted, starving, and stranded in a country that was, at that exact moment, under increasingly brutal English rule. Local Irish clans were facing their own pressures over how to handle armed foreign soldiers washing up on their beaches. Historical accounts, and this part is genuinely well documented, describe a range of outcomes. Some survivors were executed outright, on English orders, or by local authorities eager to prove loyalty to the crown. Some were sheltered, fed, and helped by Irish clans, particularly in the more remote and less English-controlled West. In a few documented cases, specifically because those clans saw a shared Catholic identity and a shared enemy in the English crown. And in a small number of cases, survivors integrated into local communities, married, and stayed. Contemporary English administrators in Ireland were deeply alarmed by these events, not because they suspected a lasting genetic legacy, but because they feared an immediate military and political one. Letters from English officials stationed in Ireland at the time expressed real concern that surviving Spanish soldiers might link up with rebellious Irish clans and reignite open conflict against the crown. Some local Irish lords did shelter and protect survivors, occasionally at real risk to themselves. Others, especially in areas more tightly under English control, cooperated with orders to round up and execute survivors on sight. The historical record here is genuinely mixed, county by county, clan by clan, which is exactly the kind of messy, inconsistent reality that tends to get smoothed over into a single clean legend a few generations later. That last detail, small in scale but real, is the one grain of actual historical truth the entire Black Irish legend eventually grew out of. And it grew fast. Within a generation or two, Black Irish became the standard explanation across Ireland and later across the Irish diaspora in America for any family branch that carried darker hair, darker eyes, or more olive complexion than their neighbors. It was simple, it was dramatic, it had a specific date and a specific disaster attached to it. And it traveled to America with millions of Irish immigrants during the Great Famine Migration of the 1840s and 1850s, where it took on a second life entirely. It explained not just individual dark-haired cousins, but entire branches of Irish-American families who looked to their neighbors distinctly different from the red-headed, freckled stereotype of Irishness that had become dominant in American popular culture. Here is the problem. When geneticists actually went looking for a distinct Spanish Armada genetic signature in modern Irish populations, they didn't find one. Not a meaningful one, and certainly not one concentrated specifically along the counties where the Armada wrecked. population-scale genetic surveys of Ireland, including the landmark Irish DNA Atlas Project, run out of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and separate broader whole genome studies of the Irish population published through the 2010s, have mapped Irish genetic variation county by county with enormous precision. If several thousand Spanish sailors had genuinely integrated into the Irish gene pool in one dramatic event in 1588, 400 and some years ago, roughly 15 to 17 generations back, you would expect to see a detectable, geographically clustered signal specifically in the western counties where the wrecks happened: Galway, Clare, Kerry, Sligo, and Donegal. That signal simply isn't there in any way that stands out from Ireland's broader genetic background. Whatever Iberian-related ancestry Irish DNA actually carries, and it does carry some, it isn't shaped like a single 16th century shipwreck event. It's shaped like something much older, much larger, and much more deeply woven into the entire Irish population, not just a few western coastal counties. So, if it's not the Armada, what is it? That's what the rest of this video is actually about. But before we get to the real explanation, I want to walk through the specific signs that tend to show up in families carrying this legend, because the pattern itself, not just the DNA, tells you a lot about how a myth like this survives for 400 years. Sign 1. Your family specifically uses the phrase Black Irish. Not just dark-haired, but that exact traditional term usually attached to one particular branch or one particular grandparent. This phrase has a very specific regional and generational footprint. It shows up heavily in Irish American communities descended from famine-era immigration, and it appears with particular intensity in certain regional clusters in Ireland itself, especially along the western seaboard counties where the Armada wrecks actually occurred: Galway, Mayo, Clare, and parts of Kerry and Cork. If you grew up hearing this exact phrase used specifically and consistently to describe a particular relative or branch of the family, rather than as a general joke about someone having a nice tan, that's a strong sign your family history intersects with a very old and specific piece of local folklore, one that has been passed down as an explanation for generations, regardless of whether the explanation itself holds up. Sign 2. Your family's Armada story has unusually specific details, a named shipwreck location, a specific county, and sometimes even a specific surname. Claimed to descend from a named Spanish sailor. This is worth paying close attention to, the more it tends to reveal about when and how it was constructed, rather than about what actually happened. Genuine 16th century oral history, passed down accurately for 400 years with no written record, essentially does not survive intact. Family stories about the Armada that include suspiciously precise details, an exact wreck site, or an exact sailor's name, are almost always later additions. They are embellishments added in the 18th or 19th century, once the Armada had already become a well-known historical event that a family could plausibly attach itself to, rather than an authentic detail passed down directly from 1588. If your family's version includes this kind of specificity, that's not necessarily a mark against your family's story being meaningful. It's actually a clue about roughly when the story took its current shape, usually much closer to the famine era than to the Armada itself. Sign 3. Your family emigrated from one of the specific Western Irish counties associated with the Armada wrecks: Galway, Clare, Kerry, Sligo, Mayo, or Donegal. This one matters less as genetic evidence, and more as an explanation for why the legend caught on so strongly in your specific family line. These counties, all along Ireland's rugged Atlantic coast, are exactly where the shipwrecks concentrated. And they are also the counties where the Black Irish legend is most deeply embedded in local folklore, independent of any individual family's DNA. If your family traces to this specific stretch of coastline, you inherited not just potential ancestry, but a genuinely old regional storytelling tradition that predates your family's specific version of it by generations. Sign 4. And this is where it starts connecting to your actual DNA test. Your ancestry results show a real measurable percentage of Iberian, Spanish, or Portuguese ancestry that the family has always explained using the Armada story. This is the sign that sends most people looking for answers in the first place. And it's also exactly where the science gets interesting. Because the DNA is real, the explanation attached to it is almost certainly wrong. Let's subscribe right now, because the next section is where we actually explain what that Iberian DNA is doing in Irish genomes if it isn't the Armada. And it is a genuinely wild piece of deep history. Every week on this channel, we dig into the real science behind the family legends that never quite added up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and let's get into it. Here's the real story, and it starts almost 4,000 years before the Armada ever set sail. Around 2500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, a massive population movement swept across Western Europe, one of the largest and most consequential migrations in the entire genetic history of the continent. This wave is associated with what archaeologists call the bell beaker culture, named for a distinctive style of pottery found at burial sites across an enormous stretch of territory, from Iberia through France into Britain and across into Ireland. Genetic research over the last decade, particularly a landmark 2018 study published in Nature by a large international team, including researchers from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Vienna, and Harvard's Ancient DNA Lab, sequenced dozens of Bronze Age skeletal remains from across Britain and Ireland and found something dramatic. Within just a handful of generations, after the Bell Beaker migration reached the British Isles, somewhere around 90% of the existing Neolithic genetic ancestry in Britain was replaced by new ancestry associated with this migration wave. Ireland shows a broadly similar, though somewhat less extreme pattern in the ancient DNA record. Here's the key detail for our purposes. The population associated with the Bell Beaker expansion did not originate in Ireland or in Britain, or even primarily in continental northern Europe. The genetic and archaeological evidence traces a significant component of this migration back to the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. Bell Beaker culture and associated genetic signatures appear notably early there in the archaeological record, before spreading north and eventually west across the Channel and the Irish Sea. In other words, a substantial wave of the ancestors of the people who would eventually become the Irish, the Bronze Age population that laid down much of the genetic foundation of the island, came from, or passed directly through, the Iberian Peninsula. This happened before the Celts, before the Vikings, before the Normans, and before any of the later invasions and migrations that Irish history is usually taught around. Roughly 4,000 years before a single Spanish Armada sailor ever set foot in Galway. This is not a fringe theory. It is one of the most well-supported findings in the entire field of European archaeogenetics over the past decade, replicated across multiple independent research teams working with ancient DNA samples from sites across Ireland, Britain, France, and Iberia. And it means that when a modern Irish DNA test shows a percentage of Iberian-related ancestry, what it is very likely detecting is not a 16th century shipwreck at all, but a genuine, deep, foundational layer of ancient migration that predates recorded Irish history entirely. A population movement so old that it happened before there was a meaningful cultural or linguistic distinction between the people who would become Iberian and the people who would become Irish in any modern sense at all. There's actually a second, completely independent line of genetic evidence that points to the exact same ancient Iberian connection. And it comes from a much narrower, more specific piece of the genome, the Y-chromosome, passed down virtually unchanged from father to son. Ireland has one of the highest concentrations on Earth of a Y-chromosome lineage called haplogroup R1b, and more specifically, a subgroup within it known as R1b M269. It is sometimes called the Atlantic modal haplotype because of how heavily it is concentrated along the Atlantic coastline of Western Europe, Ireland, Western Britain, Brittany and France, and the Iberian Peninsula. In parts of Western Ireland, this single Y chromosome lineage shows up in well over 90% of the male population, one of the highest concentrations of any single paternal lineage found anywhere in the world. Population geneticists have spent the better part of 2 decades tracing where this lineage actually originated, and the leading models, built from ancient DNA, recovered at Bronze Age burial sites across Western Europe, point back toward an expansion that either passed directly through, or in some models originated in, the Iberian Peninsula. From there, it spread north into France, then across into Britain and Ireland, carried by the same broad Bell Beaker-associated migration wave we just talked about. Some researchers have proposed that this lineage survived the last ice age in a refuge population in Iberia, one of a small number of ice-free pockets in Western Europe, during the depths of the last glacial period. It then re-expanded outward across the continent as the ice retreated. Thousands of years before the Bronze Age Beaker expansion added a second, later layer on top of it. Either way, the paternal line evidence and the whole genome ancient DNA evidence are independently converging on the same basic geography. Ireland's deepest ancestral roots run directly through the Iberian Peninsula by way of 2 separate ancient migrations, one from the depths of the Ice Age and one from the Bronze Age, thousands of years apart from each other, and both thousands of years before a single Spanish sailor ever set foot in Galway. Sign 5. Your DNA test shows Iberian or Southern European ancestry at a level too high and too consistent to plausibly trace back to a single event 400 years ago. This is really the mathematical heart of why the Armada theory doesn't hold up once you actually run the numbers. 16 or 17 generations back from today lands you in the late 1500s, right around the Armada. At that generational distance, a single ancestor, even a fully Spanish one, would statistically contribute an almost vanishingly small percentage to your total ancestry today, diluted by half with every single generation in between. A modern Irish person showing several percentage points of Iberian ancestry is not showing you the genetic contribution of one shipwrecked sailor 16 generations back. They're showing you a much older, much larger population level signal, one embedded across the entire Irish gene pool roughly 4,000 years ago. Not diluted down from a single recent event, but present at some level in nearly the entire modern Irish population as a shared ancient inheritance. Sign 6. Your family has other pieces of folklore attached to physical appearance, specifically around dark hair and eyes being treated as unusual or notable within an otherwise fair-skinned, red-haired Irish family narrative. This connects to something genuinely interesting in the population genetics of Ireland specifically. Ireland actually has one of the highest concentrations of red hair and pale, freckled complexions of any population on Earth, tied to a specific variant of the MC1R gene that reaches unusually high frequency across the island. Because that particular genetic signature became so strongly associated with Irish identity, especially in American popular culture, from the 19th century onward, darker-haired, darker-eyed Irish family members stood out by comparison. And they needed an explanation within families that had come to think of red hair and pale skin as the authentic Irish look. In reality, dark hair and eyes have always been common across Ireland too. They are genetically unremarkable, present since the same Bronze Age population layer we just talked about, and in many cases entirely unrelated to any additional Iberian or Southern European ancestry at all. The Black Irish explanation didn't emerge because dark features were genetically rare in Ireland. It emerged because red hair had become so culturally central to what Irish identity was supposed to look like from the outside that any deviation from it demanded a story. Sign 7. Your family's oral history and your DNA results together tell a story that's actually more interesting than the myth ever was. Ancient Iberian ancestry arrived in Ireland thousands of years before written history, layered underneath everything that came later. The Celtic language and culture arrived and spread across the existing population rather than replacing it wholesale. The Viking raids and settlements of the 8th through 10th centuries left their own genetic mark, particularly in coastal port cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Cork. Then came the Norman arrival in the 12th century, and finally the famine-era immigration that carried all of that layered ancestry across the Atlantic to America, where a 400-year-old shipwreck story eventually became attached to it, as the easiest explanation available at the time. It's worth understanding the layers that came after that ancient Iberian migration too, because they help explain why Irish DNA today looks the way it does, and why no single explanation, Armada included, was ever going to account for the full picture. Roughly 1,000 years after the Bell Beaker expansion, Celtic language and culture spread across Ireland. But the genetic evidence increasingly suggests this was much more of a cultural and linguistic shift, new language, new art styles, and new social structures layered onto the existing Bronze Age population, rather than a wholesale replacement of the people already living there. Centuries later, beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders began arriving from Scandinavia, and by the mid-800s they had established permanent settlements at Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, founding several of Ireland's most important port cities in the process. Genetic studies of these urban populations, and of Irish surnames with Norse origins that still exist today, show a real, measurable Scandinavian genetic contribution. But that contribution is concentrated specifically in those port city populations, rather than spread evenly across the island. Then, in 1169, Anglo-Norman forces arrived, adding yet another distinct layer. This one brought its own genetic and surname legacy, still visible in Irish records today. By the time you reach the Great Famine Emigration of the 1840s, the Irish genome carried all of these layers stacked on top of one another. Ancient Iberian-related ancestry as the deepest foundation, a Celtic cultural overlay, Viking contributions concentrated in specific port cities, and Norman influence layered on top of that. A 400-year-old shipwreck was never going to be the whole explanation for any of it. And once you see the actual layers, it's obvious why. Here's what to actually look for in your own results, now that you understand what you're looking at. If your test shows Iberian, Spanish, Portuguese, or broader Southern European ancestry, alongside a dominant Irish or broader Celtic profile, and your family has always explained it with the Armada story, that ancestry almost certainly isn't telling you about 1588. It's very likely telling you about a population movement that happened around 2500 BCE, a foundational layer of ancient migration baked into the genetic history of the entire island. One that predates the Celts, predates the Vikings, and predates every invasion and settlement that Irish history usually gets built around in school. If your test groups you into broader Irish or Irish diaspora genetic communities on platforms like Ancestry DNA, and you see Iberian ancestry consistently mentioned as part of that broader community's shared genetic background, rather than as something unique to your specific family, that's the platform's own algorithm independently confirming the same population level pattern. The ancient DNA research has been documenting for the last decade, a signal shared across huge sections of the Irish population, not a rare trait unique to one shipwrecked family line. There's something worth sitting with here before we wrap up, because it says a lot about how family legends actually work. The Spanish Armada story didn't survive for 400 years because it was true. It survived because it was useful. It gave families a dramatic, specific, satisfying explanation for something they could see with their own eyes. A cousin who looked different, a grandmother with olive skin and black hair, and a family full of redheads. And it gave that explanation a real historical event to attach itself to, one dramatic and well-known enough that nobody questioned it too closely for a few hundred years. The real explanation, a 4,000-year-old population migration out of the Iberian Peninsula that helped form the genetic foundation of Ireland itself, is honestly a far bigger and stranger story than a shipwreck. It just took modern ancient DNA sequencing technology to prove it. Because unlike a shipwreck with named ships and recorded dates, a Bronze Age population movement left no written record at all. It only left itself behind, quietly, in the genome of everyone descended from it, waiting 4,000 years for the technology to finally exist that could read it. So if you grew up hearing the words Black Irish in your family, if there's a specific relative or branch of your family tree that's always looked a little different, and if your DNA test has ever come back showing Iberian or Southern European ancestry, that the family explained away with a shipwreck story. You're not wrong that there's a real ancestral thread there. You're just off by about 3,900 years, on when it actually happened. Subscribe right now if this video finally explained a family legend you've been hearing your entire life. Every week on this channel, we dig this deep into the real science, behind the stories families have been telling for generations, the ones that turn out to be almost right and completely wrong at the exact same time. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and leave a comment down below. Did your family ever use the phrase Black Irish? Does your DNA test show Iberian or Spanish ancestry nobody in your family could ever explain? Tell me which county your family traces back to in Ireland. Let's figure out together whether your family's story lines up with the Armada or with something a whole lot older. That's where the real conversations happen on this channel.